Crop circles appear in more than 50 countries, and there literally have been thousands of them, maybe over 10,000 crop circles that we're aware of in the modern era.
Somewhere in a server room, far from any wheat field, a machine was handed 12,000 photographs and told almost nothing. No context, no folklore, no hint that the shapes in front of it had spent 50 years dividing scientists, farmers, tourists, and late-night television hosts into opposing camps. It was simply asked to look at each image, measure it, and place it on a timeline. What came back wasn't a verdict on aliens, hoaxers, or energy vortices. It was a graph, and graphs, unlike people, don't have an opinion to defend. They just show you where the line is going. In this case, the line was going somewhere nobody expected, and it was doing it faster than it had any right to. To understand why that graph matters, you have to understand the raw material it was built from. Crop circles, or more accurately, crop formations, since most of them stopped being simple circles decades ago, have been documented in more than 30 countries since the late 1970s. The heaviest concentration by far sits in southern England, in the county of Wiltshire, a stretch of chalk downland that has been home to enormous deliberate earthworks for thousands of years before anyone owned a camera. Stonehenge rises out of Salisbury Plain, a short drive from the fields where the modern formations cluster. Avebury, a few miles north, contains the largest prehistoric stone circle in Europe. Silbury Hill, an artificial chalk mound taller than a 10-story building, was raised around 4,000 years ago by people who left no written explanation for why. Whatever else is true about crop circles, they keep showing up within walking distance of monuments built by people who clearly liked drawing enormous, precise shapes into the landscape long before anyone had a word for hoax. The formations themselves follow a strange, consistent pattern of behavior. They appear overnight, typically between the last light of dusk and the first light of dawn, in fields of standing wheat or barley that were empty and undisturbed the evening before. By the time a farmer walks the property at sunrise, the shape is simply there, finished, symmetrical, and usually enormous, sometimes stretching longer than a football field. There are rarely footprints leading in. There is rarely any sign of the tools that must have been used. The stalks aren't broken. They're bent, pressed flat in swirling patterns that follow the geometry of the design rather than radiating outward in a mess. People who walk into the formations shortly after they're discovered report a cluster of strange physical sensations. Compasses that spin without settling, camera batteries that drain in minutes, phone signals that cut out and then return once you're back at the car. None of that proves anything on its own. A field is not a laboratory, and people primed to expect something odd will often feel something odd. But the reports have been remarkably consistent across decades, countries, and witnesses who had never spoken to one another. For most of the public, the entire subject was closed in September 1991, when two retirees from Hampshire walked into a newspaper office and announced that they, personally, had been making crop circles since 1976. Their names were Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley. Bauer had spent years working in Australia in the 1960s, where he'd heard stories of flattened saucer nests in reed beds, and the idea stuck with him. Chorley was a landscape painter. According to the account they gave at the time, the two men had been having a drink one evening near a favorite stretch of downland when Bauer suggested, more or less as a joke, that they give the local UFO enthusiasts something to argue about. Their method was almost comically simple. A wooden plank with a loop of rope at each end, stepped on and dragged to flatten a path through the crop, a length of string tied to a stake to hold a consistent radius for circles, and eventually a baseball cap fitted with a loop of wire on the brim, used like a gun sight to keep long, straight lines true in total darkness. They demonstrated the technique for reporters and researchers, who confirmed the results looked indistinguishable from real formations. Bauer and Chorley claimed credit for more than 200 circles over roughly 15 years, and for a large segment of the public, that was the end of the conversation. Two bored Englishmen with a plank. Case closed. Except the case didn't stay closed because the shapes didn't stop getting stranger after 1991. They got stranger faster. And that's the detail the AI analysis was actually built to investigate. Not are crop circles real, in the sense of paranormal, but a much narrower and more answerable question. Does the complexity of these designs follow a pattern over time? And if so, What does that pattern look like when you strip away 50 years of argument and just measure the shapes? The technical work of building that dataset was tedious in a way that doesn't translate well to a 5-minute news segment. Researchers pulled together roughly 12,000 photographs spanning 5 decades, shot by hundreds of different photographers using hundreds of different cameras, at hundreds of different altitudes, in every kind of light. Some images were faded prints from the late 1970s, scanned off yellowing paper. Others were high-resolution drone footage from the last few years. None of that raw material was directly comparable, and a naive system would have scored the drone images as more detailed simply because the equipment was better, not because the formations were more complex. So the first step was correction. Every image was digitally flattened, the oblique angle of the photograph mathematically pushed back until the design appeared as though it had been shot from directly overhead. Then every formation was rescaled against a known real-world measurement present somewhere in the frame. The width of a tractor path, the spacing of a combine harvester's wheels, the length of a farm gate, so that a circle photographed in Wiltshire in 1985 could be measured against a formation photographed in Alberta in 2004 using the same units. The second step was separating the design from the field itself. Standing wheat, photographed from above, is visually noisy. Thousands of individual stalks that read as texture rather than shape. Flattened crop, by contrast, lies in a smooth, swirled surface that catches and reflects light differently. The system was trained to detect that boundary and reduce every photograph to a simple two-tone mask. White for flattened crop, black for standing crop. Color, crop type, weather, and location were stripped away entirely. What remained was pure geometry, the shape and nothing else. From there, each mask was scored on a handful of measurable properties. How many discrete elements did the design contain, counting every ring, arc, box, and connecting corridor as a separate unit? How deep did the nesting run, meaning how many layers of shapes were embedded inside other shapes? How many axes of symmetry did the design hold, and did that symmetry survive consistently across the entire formation or break down toward the edges? Those numbers were combined into a single complexity score for each formation. A rough metric, admittedly, but one applied identically across all 12,000 images, which turns out to be worth far more than 50 years of people arguing that one formation looked harder than another. Each image was also tagged with metadata. The country and coordinates where it appeared, the date it was discovered, the crop type, and critically, whether the formation had ever been publicly claimed by a known human circle maker, whether that was Bauer and Chorley, a later group like the Collective Circle Makers founded by artist John Lundberg, or a television production crew. The system itself was never told what a crop circle was supposed to mean. It wasn't given any background on UFOs, ley lines, or plasma vortices. As far as the software was concerned, it was processing two-tone geometric shapes with dates attached, nothing more. That's the entire point of building it this way. A system with no beliefs can't be accused of wanting a particular answer to be true. It has no reputation riding on the outcome, no algorithm designed to find mystery where there isn't one. It just measures and reports what it measures. There were two boring outcomes this kind of analysis could have produced, and either one would have quietly ended the story. The first possibility was random noise, which is roughly what you'd expect from decades of uncoordinated, unrelated pranksters working independently with no shared plan. The second was flat repetition, the same handful of circle and ring combinations recycled over and over, which is what you'd expect from a small number of copycats imitating a known technique without innovating much. The dataset returned neither. Instead, it returned a curve. And to understand why that curve is interesting, it helps to start exactly where the record starts, with the least impressive shape in the entire 50-year archive. The earliest documented formations, concentrated in the late 1970s at sites like Cheesefoot Head in Hampshire, are almost embarrassingly simple. A single circle, one patch of flattened wheat, stalks swirled in one direction, no rings, no satellites, no geometry beyond a basic closed curve. Picture the discovery, because it happened this same way hundreds of times across the archive. A farmer walking the headland at dawn before the day's heat sets in, and there in the middle of a field is a gap that shouldn't be there. A nearly perfect circle, crop lying flat and swirled from a center point with no stake, no visible tool marks, and dew still resting undisturbed on the bent stalks. meaning it had appeared before the dew fell overnight. Most people who found these early circles didn't think much of it. A whirlwind, maybe. Deer bedding down. A story mentioned to a neighbor over a fence and forgotten by lunch. When the analysis reached these earliest formations, it scored them near 0 on the complexity index. A nesting depth of exactly 1, since a circle is about as simple as a shape can get. 1 center point, 1 radius, 1 unbroken line. In isolation, that means nothing, but read as the first entry in a 50-year sequence, it functions almost like the opening line of a very long document. Simple, deliberate, and clearly meant to be the starting point of something rather than the whole of it. What happened next is the part of the record that actually justifies lining up 12,000 photographs in the first place. If the shapes had stayed simple circles for 5 decades, there would be no pattern worth discussing, just a long-running, mildly interesting rural prank. Instead, starting around 1980, the formations began adding structure. A large central circle would appear with smaller satellite circles arranged around it at even, deliberate spacing like a diagram rather than a doodle. Then came clusters of 5 circles arranged in careful symmetry. Then rings nested inside rings. A single circle in a field is easy to dismiss as weather or wildlife. For circles arranged in a precise line down the middle of a barley field is a much harder thing to wave away because it requires someone to have planned it before setting foot in the crop. And yet the field showed no trace of how anyone walked in and back out across dozens of meters of standing wheat, without leaving a single obvious corridor of crushed stalks. By the mid-1980s, the designs had grown complicated enough that circle makers were routinely hiring light aircraft just to document their own work properly, because from ground level the shapes were unreadable. A farmer standing at the edge of his own field saw nothing but a sprawl of bent stalks. Damage without any obvious meaning. Lift the same field 200 feet into the air, and the sprawl resolved into something balanced and centered, clearly composed for a viewer looking straight down rather than for someone standing in a weed at 2 in the morning who could barely see 4 rows in any direction. That detail alone should have complicated the bored prankster's explanation, because it meant whoever was building these things was designing for an aerial perspective they themselves would likely never see in person, at least not until the photographs came back. The analysis also noted something else about this period. The formations weren't simply repeating themselves season after season. A skilled hoaxer, even a very good one, tends to reuse techniques that already work. But the mid-1980s formations rarely repeated the prior year's design outright. They built on it, adding a new element, an extra axis of symmetry, a cleaner execution, almost like a student handing in progressively harder homework rather than someone doodling the same shape from memory. Then, in 1989, researchers Colin Andrews and Pat Delgado published a book on the subject that became an unexpected commercial success, and with the resulting media attention came the two camps whose argument has more or less defined the public conversation ever since. One insisting on an extraordinary explanation, the other insisting on plywood and rope. The louder that argument got, the less anyone actually looked at the underlying geometry, which is a shame, because both sides were on the hook for explaining the same inconvenient fact. If this was entirely the work of hoaxers, they were training themselves to execute flawless nighttime geometry with an apparent failure rate close to 0, a strange level of consistency for an amateur nocturnal hobby involving no rehearsal space and no daylight. Then came the moment the curve stops behaving like a gradual climb and starts behaving like something else entirely. Up through the late 1980s, the complexity score had been rising in small, patient increments, a bit more symmetry each season, one additional ring, a steadier hand year over year. That kind of curve is easy to explain. It's what an apprenticeship looks like, whoever the apprentice might be. Then, in the summer of 1990, the line didn't step upward. It jumped. On July 12th of that year, in a barley field below the Alton Barnes Chalk Hill figure in Wiltshire, a formation appeared that stretched roughly 600 feet from end to end. Not a circle with minor decoration, but a full composition of circles, rings, rectangular boxes, straight connecting corridors, and forked appendages complex enough that the press started calling these things pictograms, because from the air, they genuinely resembled a form of writing. Similar formations appeared at Chilcombe Down weeks earlier and at Stanton St. Bernard weeks later. In a single summer, the entire vocabulary around the phenomenon shifted. because the shapes had stopped resembling circles at all. The following July, at the foot of Barbary Castle, a formation appeared in the shape of a triangle roughly 180 feet on each side, with 3 large circular features at its corners, each one internally different from the other two, a ratcheted spiral in one, concentric rings in another. Executing something like that requires a plan drawn to scale ahead of time and then carried out at night, in a field, with no fixed reference points, at a size where a single degree of angular drift would have visibly wrecked the whole design. Nearly everything that came before 1990 clustered in one band of complexity, 3 or 4 elements, occasionally 5, well within reach of a small determined team working with boards, string, and one long summer night. What began appearing from 1990 onward sat far above that band. Formations with 15 or 20 distinct nested elements, each holding a precise angular relationship to the ones around it, with symmetry maintained across the entire field and no measurable drift from one side to the other. What makes the 1990 threshold genuinely strange isn't only the size of the jump, it's the absence of a bridge. A gradual technical advance should produce transitional seasons connecting the old band of complexity to the new one. The archive doesn't really contain that bridge. The transition reads as close to vertical. One season the fields were producing the equivalent of short, simple sentences, and the very next they were producing interlocking paragraphs, as if an intermediate stage of the learning curve had simply been skipped. And the jump wasn't confined to one location, which matters a great deal. If a single skilled team in Wiltshire had quietly perfected a new technique, you'd expect that sophistication to show up first in one place and then spread outward gradually, the way any shared trick spreads, appearing months or years later in the Netherlands, in Canada, in the wheat fields of New South Wales at the speed of people telling other people. Instead, the threshold was crossed in multiple countries within the same narrow window, in fields separated by oceans, languages, and every ordinary barrier that should slow a shared technique down. This is the exact point in the archive where the Bauer and Chorley confession does the most explanatory work, and also the point where it starts to strain. Their account genuinely explains a great deal. It accounts for the concentration of formations in Wiltshire, since that's where they lived and drank. It accounts for the aerial composition detail, since a hoax nobody photographs from above is a hoax nobody hears about. And it accounts for at least some of the 1990 jump, since by that point the two of them had been practicing privately for roughly 14 years, and by then they were far from the only people doing it. Once the phenomenon became genuinely famous, it attracted skilled imitators and outright competitors. The Collective Circle Makers, founded by artist John Lundberg, has openly produced commission formations for advertising campaigns and television productions for 3 decades and has never hidden that fact. In 2002, a team assembled for a Discovery Channel special, including researchers with engineering backgrounds, built a complex multi-element formation overnight using garden rollers and GPS-guided measurements, and it passed casual inspection by observers unaware it was staged. The case for human authorship, in other words, is genuinely strong, and it would be dishonest to present this story without saying so plainly. What that case doesn't cleanly account for is the near-simultaneous international timing of the 1990 jump, or the archive's near-total absence of visibly failed or abandoned attempts at that new level of complexity. You'd expect at least a handful of half-finished 12-element designs left ruined in a field somewhere, and the record just doesn't contain many. While the public argument over who was holding the plank consumed most of the media attention, a much smaller group of researchers quietly stopped photographing the formations from the air and started examining the plants themselves at ground level, which is where the story shifts from folklore into something closer to contested physical science. The central figure in that line of research is W.C. Levengood, a biophysicist based in Michigan who spent decades working in plant physiology and seed research before turning his attention to crop formations in the early 1990s. Working alongside researchers Nancy Talbot and John Burke as part of the BLT research team, Levengood examined plant samples taken from dozens of formations in England and the United States, publishing his findings in the peer-reviewed journal Physiologia Plantarum in 1994 and again in the Journal of Scientific Exploration in 1999. The methodology itself was unglamorous, cutting stalks at the base inside a formation, then walking well beyond its edge to cut identical control samples from undisturbed crop in the same field, same soil, same everything except the one variable in question, and then spending weeks measuring the swollen growth nodes along each stalk with calipers. 3 specific claims came out of that work. The first concerned the growth nodes themselves, the small swollen joints spaced along a serial stem. Levengood reported that in samples taken from inside formations, these nodes were measurably elongated compared to the control samples taken just outside the boundary.